All right, welcome to Module 2 of the Risk-Based Decision-Making short course. I'm Kara Morgan again, and today we're going to talk about decision outcomes. So the learning objectives for this module are shown on the screen. First, recognizing decision analysis as a field of research and practice, and second, knowing what decision outcomes are and how they are used in decision-making. So the readings for today are on Carmen on the website listed. These are materials that cover the material that I'm going to cover today and might be helpful for you to use as reference. If you haven't read them already, that's fine. And there's 4 sections on today's topic, and those are the preface and then chapters 1, 2, and 3 from a book called Smart Choices. This book was, the latest version is from 2015. It's Hammond, Keeney, and Rafa, who are kind of some of the pillars of decision analysis, and they made this resource to make decision analysis very accessible to the average person. So I highly recommend that book, and the chapters can be found on the website. So first, let's step back and think about what a decision is. Of course, we all probably know what a decision is. We've heard this word our whole lives. But we need to formalize things to make sure we're all on the same page and understanding the language in the same way. So first of all, to have a decision, you have to have a situation in which there's multiple options. If there's only one option and there's no other things that could be chosen, then that's not really a decision, that's just moving forward. So you have to have multiple options, and then you have to have a situation in which one option needs to be selected. So the decision is made when one of those options is chosen. So I'm sure you're aware decisions are commonly encountered. These are things that people have done since they were children. Some decisions are very inconsequential, you know, what you're going to eat for dinner, which side of the road you're going to walk down, for example. And some could change the course of your life in terms of where do you study, what kinds of decisions you make about your safety, who you're going to marry, those kinds of things can affect your life significantly. So one of the things that's interesting about decision making is that it's not often that we get feedback on those decisions. So if there's something that you do every day and you get information every day about whether that was a good or bad decision, then you learn about that really well. Things like how long does it take for your water to boil, or you know how long you should wait for things that you're doing every day. You get that feedback. But in a lot of decisions we make, especially decisions related to things like food safety, big policy decisions, we don't often get feedback, and that makes decision making much more difficult. So before we go on to the next slide, I just wanted you to take a few seconds and think about the decisions that you make every day. Think about some significant decisions that you may have made recently, and kind of think about those in terms of how the decision presented itself, and then what the options were in that decision, and then maybe a little bit about how you decided which path to take. So I just want you to think about in your own life how you encounter decisions and how you engage with them. So I'm going to go over a few foundational concepts in decision analysis. So first of all, it's a field that was, it's relatively new compared to other types of fields. It was really, the formal use of the term started in the 1960s. It's a field of study that has roots in mathematics, psychology, and economics, as well as other fields. It's a nice cross between lots of different disciplines. Excuse me. So, of course, there's people teach entire courses on decision analysis, and I'm not going to do that here. But I want to kind of boil down most of what the research says. And generally, the research shows that good decisions are made when 2 things are true. One is that you understand the likelihood of the possible outcomes on a topic, so you understand how sure you are about the things that will happen afterwards, and you take that into account. And number 2, that the preferences of the decision maker are taken into account. So it's not kind of an objective good decision, bad decision. Of course, there are recommendations, right, about if you care about different things, which kinds of decisions you should make. But objectively, scientifically, there's no way to say if something is a good or bad decision without understanding what the preferences of the decision maker were. So the first step in order to be able to kind of delve into decision making in this research context is to talk about what are the outcomes that you care about in a decision. And it's a little bit tricky to talk about that. So I'm going to give you some examples. So first I wanted to say, so decision analysis has really been used in the business field for all this time, really since the 60s and 70s. It's commonly used in the oil and gas industry, for example, to decide about drilling new wells. And it's also heavily used in the pharmaceutical industry to decide when different types of discovery should be pursued in terms of development into a drug. There's a lot of cost associated with both of those activities. And these technical areas have learned how to leverage the tools of decision analysis to help them make those decisions that are best in line with what they need for their company. There is some use of decision analysis in public policy as well. There's a little bit of it in food safety. There's a lot of it in environmental science, but generally in the public sector, these tools aren't as widely used as they could be, especially once you learn a little bit about how they're some of these principles that are in these readings. You realize there's a lot of valuable things about it. So part of what I'm hoping to do over the next couple decades is to make this use more prevalent in the public policy sector by bringing these types of trainings to people that are in the government. So the book I mentioned, Smart Choices, lays out a set of decision elements that are the kind of steps that you go through when you're making a decision. So as I mentioned earlier, the best practices in DA requires a definition of the consequences from each option. So if you have these three options, you'll kind of understand what the implications of each option are. So the PROACT model is in the readings, that Smart Choice reading, and it lays out these steps. First of all, what is the problem? Defining what is the decision that you're trying to make. The second one is what are the outcomes? So we're going to talk more about the outcomes and what that means in the decision. And then the rest of the things we're going to talk about over the next module or two, that is generating the alternatives or the different options that you can choose from. What are the consequences in terms of those options on the outcomes? And then what are the trade-offs? What are the things that you can't have everything you want, so you're going to have to balance all the different options to decide how you're going to choose. So in the case of risk-based decision-making, one of the outcomes that you'd be interested in would be risk. So as I mentioned, there's a short course on risk assessment that'll talk about how you estimate risk, but generally for this course, we'll just talk about risk being a likelihood and severity of harm. So there's something that could cause a harm, either a health harm or an environmental harm, and there's a certain probability that could happen, the likelihood that that could happen, and how often it happens. And then there's a severity in terms of how sick the person gets. Is it a mortality? Is it a permanent disability? Is it a short-term illness? So it's kind of that likelihood and severity of harm. That's what risk information is. So for a lot of decisions in food safety, we're thinking about, we have different options that you could have to reduce the risk, and it might be reducing the likelihood and the severity, or it might be reducing both. So the decision outcomes. So as I mentioned, in risk-based decision-making, risk is one of the outcomes, but there might be many other outcomes also. So let's talk about outcomes let's step aside from risk-based for a little bit and just talk about decision outcomes. So first I want you to think about a decision that you may have made recently. Let's think about one of the more significant decisions, not what you had for lunch, but maybe deciding to take a job or deciding to study to earn a degree. So think about all the things that you took into account when you were making that decision. If you're thinking about getting a job, you might have thought about how much is the salary, what will be my responsibilities, is this something that's lined up with what I want to be working on, how much will I need to travel, these kinds of things are what you would take into account when you're deciding which job to choose, right? So you have your current job, you might have a few job options, and you're picking from those. So these things are the decision outcomes. So things like salary, responsibilities, traveling, those are the outcomes from the decision. So those are the things that result because of the decision. So recall I mentioned earlier from decision analysis research that a good decision is one that aligns with the preferences of the decision makers. So in this case, you would have thought, is this salary right for me? Is this amount of travel right for me? So you're thinking about the outcomes in terms of how it affects you and what your preferences are. So this leads to a couple of really important principles about decision making, and when you take it from this research perspective. So one is that there is no real right choice. That you can't, as I mentioned earlier, you can't objectively say this is the right choice unless you're assuming something about a person's values. So you really have to understand what the person values, what the decision maker values, before you can decide whether or not it was a good choice. Also, when you're in the public sector, so food safety decisions are either government decisions or could be private sector, but there's a lot of people that are going to be affected by those decisions, not just the decision maker. So understanding what the stakeholder preferences are is also important. For example, there's some implications on availability of food, maybe, or cost of food, or variety of food. Those kind of things might be some things the stakeholders care about, and you want to take that into account in terms of also things they care about, like in terms of not getting sick and having reliable food security and things like that. So this step in being clear about the outcomes is a really important part of the decision process. Generally, people that don't study decision analysis and just make decisions like they have their whole life don't think about this as a separate step. They just kind of push through. They might make a list of pros and cons. That's a common tactic, but that doesn't really get to the outcomes that you care about. One thing that the research is starting to show is that when you focus on the outcomes instead of the options, it's easier to figure out where people disagree. So people might choose an option and just fight for it. But if you really break it back to, what is it about that option that you like, and get down to the outcomes, you might be able to find more agreement than you realized. So in risk-based decision making, again, decision outcomes are all the things the decision maker cares about. And the decision maker should clarify what the outcomes are by thinking about all the things that could happen in terms of the decision. What's driving the decision, and what are all the things that could happen once I make this decision. And so the fundamental piece is that there's always going to be an outcome related to risk, and the need for a risk-based decision might be related to reducing either the number of people affected, might be related to reducing the likelihood of people being affected, or could be related to reducing the severity of the outcomes. So these are all different ways you might characterize risk as an outcome. So each thing you care about is a decision outcome. For every risk-based decision, you're going to have to think through what are the things that you are interested in. And so there's possible options listed here. For the first section, there might be information about how many people are going to be exposed, how many people are going to be killed from this, how many people are going to be severely harmed. So those are all different elements of the risk outcome that you might care about. And there could be other things you care about too, and it's still a risk-based decision. You might care about things like the cost, the likelihood of success, what are the other impacts that might come about because of this change. So a risk-based decision doesn't only focus on risk, but it does always include the element of risk. And I did want to mention that the short course on risk assessment will provide more detail on how you would assess risk and what different types of measures. You might have mentioned a few measures here, but there'll be a section on that in the risk assessment course. So determining these decision outcomes is important. Each decision maker may have different things they care about in terms of making a decision, and the person analyzing the data, the risk analyst, might have some recommendations based on the data that's available, but they also should talk with the decision maker to make sure that they're capturing all the relevant information for that decision maker. So again, recall from the earlier discussion, a good decision process is one in which the preferences of the decision maker are taken into account. So understanding you can't really have the analyst do a bunch of work and just give it to the decision maker and have them make a decision. You have to have the decision maker providing input to the risk analyst to make sure that they're getting the information that they need. So part of that work is supporting the decision maker's preferences. So I'm just going to show a general table here that we'll fill in over the next few modules, but the first step is just to say, okay, if you have this decision and say you're trying to reduce risk, what is the best option for reducing risk? So you might have a bunch of options that you'll figure out later, but now you know there's 3 things you care about. Maybe it's number of people affected, how severe the outcomes are, and cost. So you would put those different decision outcomes in this table. So this slide shows what will ultimately be the tool that the decision maker use to really understand all the options in terms of the outcomes that they care about. So how do you do this in step 2 of the PROACT model? What do you care about? So there's a few ways to get at answering this question. Things like what's going to change due to this, who's going to be impacted, how might the different options vary, and also there might be negative consequences from these actions. What are the things that could happen that stakeholders won't be happy about? Make sure you capture those as well. So I hope that you were able to meet these objectives so far in this course. So the modules for the learning objectives for this module are to recognize decision analysis as a field of research, and also to know what decision outcomes are and how to use the decision making. The next module will be on generating options for decision and then getting into filling in that table that I showed you.